What if I told you that everything you believed was a lie? For many years, textbooks fed us the myth of a handful of incredibly strong Spanish conquistadors. It was believed that just a few hundred Europeans were able to single-handedly crush the most powerful empire in the New World.
In reality, the newcomers simply could not have defeated the massive Aztec army without significant local support.
Behind this small group of foreigners stood a vast force consisting of tens of thousands of motivated local warriors. Many of the continent's indigenous peoples had suffered for decades under the brutal oppression of the rulers of Tenochtitlan. They were forced to pay exorbitant tribute and hand over their people for mass ritual sacrifices.
The arrival of armed Europeans presented the oppressed tribes with the perfect opportunity to overthrow the hated empire once and for all.
The inhabitants of the independent state of Tlaxcala voluntarily provided the Spaniards with their numerous troops and supplied them with the necessary provisions. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the allied tribes became the main instrument in the destruction of their own civilization. The hidden truth that everyone keeps silent about lies in the true structure of the great Aztec state. The empire's capital controlled vast territories solely through a system of harsh, forced tribute collection. Subjugated regions were required to regularly send colossal amounts of resources to the central city.
This created constant internal tension and hidden hatred among dozens of conquered peoples.
Spanish forces landed on the coast at the height of this internal crisis. The arriving foreigners quickly assessed the situation and recognized the political weakness of the vast territory. They began systematically gathering information about conflicts between the capital and the distant provinces. Every new dialogue with local rulers confirmed the existence of a deep systemic rift. The foreigners did not have sufficient numbers for a direct military confrontation with the imperial army. Their strategy was based on finding vulnerabilities in the administration of the conquered lands. They proposed that local leaders refuse to send resources to the capital. This step instantly turned loyal provinces into open rebels. For a long time, the central government ignored the threat on the eastern fringes of its state. Imperial envoys attempted to bribe the uninvited guests with precious metals. However, the gold only confirmed the capital's wealth and fueled the ambitions of the arriving forces. The rulers' diplomatic blunders gave the rebellious provinces time to consolidate their forces. Imperial garrisons in the provinces found themselves cut off from support from the center. Rebellious sentiments spread faster than the troops could march along the mountain trails. The system of communication and control over the vast territory began to break down. The capital's monopoly on the use of force was crumbling before the eyes of thousands of people. Every kilometer traveled swelled the ranks of the united army with local inhabitants.
The European vanguard gradually dissolved into a vast mass of Native American warriors.
The military campaign was turning into a massive uprising within the empire itself. The foreigners merely provided a direction for this pent-up destructive energy. The capital's old enemies saw a unique historical opportunity to shift the balance of power. They were ready to use the strangers' unknown weapons to achieve their political goals. None of the regional leaders at the time anticipated the long-term consequences of this alliance. They were interested only in the immediate elimination of the hated central government's dominance. The tactic of pitting opponents against each other became the foundation for further advancement deep into the continent. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think of this political strategy of divide and conquer within a single territory? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most pragmatic betrayal in history? The state of Tlaxcala was completely surrounded and had been waging a continuous war with the capital for decades. This enclave maintained its independence only thanks to the rugged mountainous terrain and the constant mobilization of the population. The appearance of an unknown enemy on their borders was initially perceived as a new, large-scale threat. The first clashes between the Tlaxcalans and European forces were extremely intense. Local warriors put the foreigners' tactics to the test in a series of mountain skirmishes. They assessed the penetrating power of the arquebuses and the discipline of the steel-like formation. This forced the Tlaxcala Council of Elders to reconsider its initial defensive plan. For the Tlaxcals, this alliance was not one of subjugation, but of equal partnership. They provided porters for the heavy artillery and ensured uninterrupted logistics. The mountain passes, which could have become a trap, turned into a completely safe corridor.
The indigenous commanders marched in formation alongside the European captains.
The combined force approached the borders of the Empire's main ally, the major city of Cholula. The Tlaxcaltecs convinced the Europeans of a hidden threat within those high walls. They provided intelligence about an impending ambush in the city's narrow streets. This led to a preemptive strike of colossal destructive power. The operation in Cholula demonstrated the absolute ruthlessness of the new alliance. The city's infrastructure was destroyed, and resistance was crushed in the shortest possible time. This move deprived the capital of an important strategic buffer to the east.
News of Cholula's fall caused genuine panic in the Empire's highest circles.
After Cholula, the prestige of the United Army reached unprecedented heights. Neighboring settlements began voluntarily pledging allegiance to the new alliance. The imperial defense system was crumbling due to a domino effect and mass desertions by garrisons. No one wanted to suffer the fate of the completely destroyed allied city. The emperor was forced to invite this massive hostile army right into his capital. He hoped to keep the situation under control through complex diplomatic maneuvers within the palace. This decision proved to be a fatal mistake for the entire state. Do you think it would have been possible to stop this coalition on the distant approaches? Something you had never seen before was unfolding on the embankments of the Great Lakes City. Tens of thousands of allied warriors and hundreds of steel-clad Europeans were entering Tenochtitlan. The vast metropolis, built on the water, was striking for its intricate architecture and strict layout. It was a masterpiece of engineering that would soon become an impenetrable stone trap. The guests were housed in a vast palace complex right in the heart of the city. The emperor sought to demonstrate his superiority through generosity and lavish hospitality. However, the Europeans and their Tlaltec allies immediately began fortifying the quarters assigned to them.
They transformed the guest palace into an impregnable bastion, right in the heart of the enemy capital.
The city's economy began to suffer from the need to support a massive army of outsiders. Food stores quickly emptied, while demands for gold only increased. The townspeople watched as their wealth was melted down into ingots convenient for transport. Muted discontent grew into open hostility toward the occupiers. The empire's system of governance began to crumble from within due to the captive rulers' inaction. Priests and the military elite began secretly forming new centers of resistance. They were preparing a large-scale plan to expel the foreigners and their allies from the city. The tension in the air became physically palpable with each passing day. The European commanders realized they were completely isolated on the island. Any mass uprising by the townspeople could cut them off from the mainland, their only hope of salvation. The bridges on the dams could be easily dismantled, turning the city into an impregnable fortress.
The trap could snap shut at any moment, at a single signal from the local commanders.
The city's architecture initially worked against the allies entrenched in the palace. Narrow canals and dense buildings prevented the effective use of cavalry. The city's rooftops could at any moment become convenient platforms for an attack. The space was rapidly narrowing, leaving the coalition with minimal room to maneuver. The sense of impending disaster united the Europeans and Tlascans into a single mechanism for survival. They understood that a safe retreat without a fight was no longer possible. The Empire was preparing to launch a counterattack of colossal destructive power. If you enjoy this kind of in-depth analysis of historical events, be sure to like this video. Guess what happened next in the tension-filled metropolis? The absence of the chief European commander provoked a fatal tactical error by his deputy. During a major religious holiday, the capital's high-ranking officials gathered in the main square. The deputy interpreted this mass gathering as the start of an armed uprising. European forces blocked all exits from the square and launched a devastating preemptive strike. The imperial elite was wiped out within a few tense hours. This action completely destroyed what remained of diplomatic relations between the two sides. The city instantly erupted in fury, turning into a single hostile armed camp. Attempts to use the captured emperor to calm the crowd ended in complete failure. The townspeople rejected his authority and chose a new, utterly uncompromising military leader. The empire had finally cast off the paralyzing shackles of submission to outsiders. Now it was a war of total annihilation with not the slightest possibility of negotiation. The Europeans' artillery tore huge gaps in the attacking ranks, but there were simply too many men. The local warriors attacked in unending waves, ignoring the massive destruction. They used long spears and heavy stones, hurling them from the roofs of neighboring buildings. The pressure on the defenders increased exponentially with every hour of the exhausting siege. The coalition's resources, locked inside the palace, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The shortage of fresh drinking water had become a more serious threat than the enemy's weapons. The Tlaxcalians tried to dig deep wells right into the palace's stone floor. The defenders' strength was rapidly waning from constant strain and a complete lack of sleep. Preparations for the breakout were conducted in the strictest secrecy so as not to alert the vigilant besiegers. Heavy artillery and most of the gathered treasures had become an insurmountable burden. The commanders ordered that only the bare essentials for combat be taken along. Discipline began to crack at the seams under the immense weight of the gold bars. The coalition waited for a dark, rainy night to launch its extremely risky operation. The heavy silence over the lake concealed the massive mobilization of the city's defenders. The capital was preparing to swallow its enemies in the dark waters of its deep canals. Are you ready to find out how the most decisive night in the history of this alliance unfolded? The retreat began under the cover of a heavy downpour, which masked the noise of the advancing army. The advance guard successfully installed a wooden platform on the first damaged section of the long dam. Cavalry and infantry began a slow advance along a narrow strip of land amid the water. Tlaxcal warriors covered the vulnerable flanks and carried heavy portable bridges. The silence was suddenly broken by loud alarm signals from the city's watchtowers. The dark lake was instantly covered with hundreds of boats carrying the capital's prepared defenders. The attack began simultaneously from all sides, creating an incredibly intense battle. The narrow causeway made it completely impossible for the Europeans to deploy an effective battle formation. All the artillery was lost at the very start of the breakthrough, depriving the coalition of powerful fire support. The organized defense turned into scattered skirmishes in the mud and water. The united army broke up into thousands of individuals, desperately fighting for their lives. Coordination of actions was completely and irrevocably lost in the darkness and noise. The city warriors methodically destroyed the dam in front of and behind the retreating columns. They took prisoners right from the ranks of the fleeing coalition, dragging them into maneuverable boats. Every obstacle they passed cost an incredible amount of effort and a huge number of lives. The path to salvation had turned into an endless, dark corridor of unceasing attacks. The vanguard managed, with great difficulty, to break through to the safety of the mainland, but the bulk of the troops remained on the dam. Commanders attempted to organize counterattacks to rescue the straggling units. However, the narrow space and complete darkness made these attempts virtually hopeless. The army was losing its best fighters and all its accumulated material advantage. The retreat continued through hostile territory with absolutely no food or supplies. Numerous local garrisons began actively pursuing the weakened enemy. Every kilometer of the arduous journey was accompanied by constant skirmishes and prepared ambushes. The army was on the brink of total and unconditional annihilation. The coalition moved with its last ounce of strength toward the borders of Tlaxcala, not knowing how they would be received after such a defeat. Political agreements could easily collapse under the weight of the Allies' colossal losses. Further survival depended entirely on the decision of the Council of Elders of the Mountain Enclave. That rainy night marked the lowest point for the Europeans and their partners. The secret that would change the nature of warfare lay in the Tlaxcalans' cold political decision. The exhausted remnants of the European detachment reached the safe borders of their mountain allies. The Tlaxcala Council of Elders had the perfect opportunity to easily destroy the weakened newcomers and seize their weapons. Many young, ambitious Native American commanders were calling for precisely such a radical solution to the problem. Previous experience had clearly shown that direct assaults and head-on attacks were completely insufficient. The vast city on the water demanded a systematic approach and fundamentally new technological solutions. The coalition's engineers proposed building a fleet of mobile brigantines to gain complete control over the lake. This would guarantee the loss of the metropolis's logistical advantage and maneuverability. Implementing this plan required a massive mobilization of all of Tlaxcala's resources. Thousands of experienced Native American craftsmen began working non-stop to harvest timber and resin in the forests. The Europeans provided precise blueprints and metal components for the ship's construction. The entire rugged mountain enclave was transformed into a massive militarized shipyard. The imperial capital also wasted no time, diligently preparing for the decisive battle. They reinforced the dams, deepened the defensive canals, and built new fortifications. The island city was preparing to become an absolutely impregnable maritime fortress. The new emperor consolidated his power and drew troops from the remaining loyal provinces. The situation was complicated by the emergence of an invisible and deadly factor, a severe disease. An unknown ailment began to spread rapidly across the continent, striking densely populated regions. This factor introduced unpredictable chaos into the demographics and governance of both opposing sides. The invisible threat shifted the balance of power faster than any weapon ever invented. The dismantled brigantines had to be carried by hand for dozens of kilometers to the lake. Tens of thousands of strong Tlaxcala porters took on this titanic task. A massive procession carrying the ship parts moved through narrow mountain passes under heavy guard. It was a logistical operation of unparalleled complexity for that time. The coalition's arrival at the lake's shores marked the beginning of a new phase in the protracted conflict. The ships were quickly assembled and ceremoniously launched, equipped with light artillery. The steel ring around the island metropolis began to tighten inexorably. How could the city's defenders possibly stand up to a fleet on their own lake under these conditions? The strategy of the new campaign differed radically from the previous direct and rapid invasion. The Alliance Command decided to methodically destroy the capital's entire life support infrastructure. The first target was the giant aqueduct that supplied fresh water from the mainland to the island. The destruction of this vital facility was the first step toward the total isolation of the metropolis. The vast city was completely deprived of a constant source of clean drinking water. Residents were forced to rely on the brackish water of the lake and extremely rare rains. This immediately led to a sharp decline in the overall combat effectiveness of the numerous defenders. The metropolis's complex logistics began to break down under this systemic pressure. A fleet of newly built brigantines established absolute control over the lake's waters. They easily routed the formations of light Native American canoes, using the power of the wind and their shipboard artillery. Food supplies from loyal coastal villages were completely and reliably blocked. The island found itself under an absolute and inescapable economic blockade. The presence of a mobile fleet allowed the Europeans to quickly deploy reinforcements to the most difficult sections. Ships provided powerful fire support from the flanks, protecting the advancing infantry. This deprived the numerous imperial army of its main advantage, maneuverability on the water. The ring of the long siege tightened slowly, but absolutely inexorably. Inside the city, a brutal, protracted famine began, breaking the will of the weak and enraging the strong. Desperate people began to eat tough roots, tree bark, and seaweed. An invisible disease continued to weaken the city, leaving entire neighborhoods without defenders. The great city was slowly losing ground from within, despite desperate resistance along the perimeter. The Tlaxcala allies showed absolute ruthlessness toward their long-standing enemies. They took no prisoners and deliberately destroyed every stone structure in their path. For them, this was a war of principle aimed at the complete annihilation of the center of imperial power. Hatred accumulated over decades found an outlet in the methodical obliteration of the city from the face of the earth. The siege lasted for many months, turning the former architectural marvel into a pile of smoking ruins. Every captured district was mercilessly razed to the ground to deprive the defenders of cover. The vast metropolis was reduced to dust by the very hands of those who had recently paid tribute to it. The finale of this historical drama was only a matter of time. The final stage of the long siege became a true triumph of the tactics of total destruction. European commanders ordered the demolition of absolutely every building as the Allied forces advanced. The stone rubble of luxurious palaces and temples was used to completely fill in the water channels. The great city on the water was methodically transformed into a continuous, flat expanse of solid land. This harsh decision deprived the defenders of the ability to use agile boats and rooftops for counterattacks. The cavalry and artillery gained the necessary room to maneuver in the completely cleared areas. The magnificent ancient architecture of the capital was destroyed solely for military expediency. The Tlaxcals, with incredible zeal, demolished every visible symbol of the power of their former oppressors. The remnants of the once great imperial army were driven back to the most remote part of the city. There, hundreds of thousands of exhausted residents and surviving soldiers were densely concentrated. The space was so overcrowded that any organized movement became practically impossible. The defense turned into the prolonged agony of a state driven into a corner. Immediately after the end of active hostilities, the long process of dividing the spoils began. The Tlaxcalians began systematically transporting the remaining material valuables to their mountain enclave. They considered this to be entirely legitimate compensation for decades of harsh economic oppression. The city was subjected to total looting by tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. The victors forcibly compelled all surviving residents to leave the ruined districts of the capital. Huge masses of emaciated people set out for the mainland in search of food and a new refuge. The capital was finally transformed into a lifeless, gray wasteland of broken stone and ash. The greatest center of civilization vanished forever from the political map of the continent. The fall of the impregnable metropolis sent shockwaves through all the remote regions of the empire. Local leaders quickly realized that the old system of power had been destroyed forever. They began hastily sending diplomatic missions to the new masters of the situation. No one wanted to voluntarily share the grim fate of the ruined island capital. The Tlaxcals celebrated their greatest historical and military victory with great fanfare. They were absolutely certain that their status as equal partners would ensure their long-term prosperity. The destruction of the empire seemed to them the beginning of a new, bright era of independence. They had no idea that the hidden mechanism of their own enslavement had already been set in motion. The first months following the complete destruction of the capital seemed like an unqualified triumph for the Allied tribes. Tlaxcal commanders moved with absolute freedom across the territories of their former bitterest enemies. They regularly received honors and a share of the tribute collected from the conquered and terrified provinces. The autonomy treaties formally remained in effect and were strictly observed. Tlaxcala's legal autonomy was constantly subjected to powerful bureaucratic attacks. New officials arriving from across the ocean did not recognize the old oral agreements with the pioneers. They imposed new exorbitant taxes and fees, completely ignoring previous promises. Legal battles over Native American rights dragged on for years without any tangible results. The economic structure of the entire region was completely reoriented toward the export of resources. Fertile fields, which had previously provided food for the population, were now planted with cash crops. Exhausting labor in the mines became the primary occupation for hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Resources were extracted from the continent on an industrial scale unprecedented in history. The old elites of the Allied tribes gradually but irrevocably lost their real influence. Their children were sent to new colonial schools, where they were indoctrinated with a foreign culture and language. Traditional, centuries-old beliefs were actively suppressed by the new administration. The unique identity of the proud warriors quickly dissolved into the new colonial realities. The infrastructure built by the Indians fell into complete disrepair or was rebuilt. New long roads were laid exclusively for transporting mined silver to the ports. The needs of the local population were completely and demonstratively ignored by the new administration. The vast continent turned into a raw materials appendage of a distant overseas crown. A demographic catastrophe continued due to unbearable working conditions and newly introduced diseases. The total population of the indigenous people decreased several-fold over the course of a single century. Entire tribes and distinct cultures vanished forever from the face of the earth. The scale of this protracted tragedy far exceeded any losses during the military campaign. The proud and powerful enclave of Tlaxcala turned into an ordinary, albeit slightly privileged province. Their invaluable assistance in the conquest became nothing more than an inconvenient historical fact for the new authorities. The tool had flawlessly fulfilled its bloody function and was coldly cast aside as unnecessary. The policy of pragmatism played the cruelest joke on its short-sighted creators. The history of the alliance between Europeans and local tribes became a classic example of the deepest historical irony. The Indians sincerely tried to use the foreigners to free themselves from the tyranny of a neighboring powerful empire. As a result, they forged with their own hands the chains of a far more brutal and prolonged subjugation. A local regional conflict was instantly swallowed up by the global process of colonization. The destruction of the vast island capital became a vivid symbol of the collapse of the entire Old World Order. This architectural and profound political catastrophe altered the trajectory of an entire continent. The old, protracted conflicts between tribes lost their meaning in the face of a new, absolute power. A new transcontinental empire arose from the stone ruins of the Native American states. The memory of this ambiguous alliance remained a very complex issue for descendants for a long time. The Tlaxcaltecs were very often accused of outright betrayal of the interests of the indigenous population. However, at the time decisions were made, they acted solely in the interests of their state's survival. The concept of a single, united Native American race simply did not exist at that time. Numerous documents from that era preserve the Tlaxcal's endless petitions to the crown. They constantly reminded the authorities of their outstanding merits during the long siege of the great city. Sometimes they managed to secure a temporary reduction in taxes or the preservation of certain land rights. But these were only extremely minor concessions within the framework of a harsh colonial system. The economic potential of the region, for which the Long War was fought, turned out to be incredible. Huge flows of silver transformed the economy of the entire world, powerfully stimulating global trade. But the very creators of this new wealth remained forever on the sidelines of history. They became merely tiny cogs in the gigantic mechanism of the global economic machine. The events surrounding the siege of the great capital are still studied in detail by military historians. It is an absolutely unprecedented example of the mobilization and integration of disparate forces into a single army. The logistics, diplomacy, and engineering solutions of this complex campaign are staggering in their scale. It was a truly brilliant tactical victory that quickly led to a strategic defeat. The lessons of this ancient campaign remain relevant in today's geopolitical realities. Relying on powerful external forces to resolve internal conflicts always carries fatal risks. A tool of foreign political influence can easily turn into a mechanism of direct control. This story serves as a stark reminder of the true cost of political illusions. We see that the fall of the greatest empire of the New World was not a miracle, but the result of a complex political game and cold calculation. The scale of the change in power and the long-term consequences of this alliance permanently redrew the map of the world, leaving the former victors in a subordinate position. How do you assess Tlaxcala's political decision as a stroke of genius or a fatal mistake? Suggest topics for future videos you'd like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.